So the agenda for our time together today, if we can go to the next slide, is first, I'd like to introduce special education broadly and generally. Then Gabriella will talk us through what we call a special education roadmap. We will next talk in a little more detail about what goes in an IEP. And then we will save some time at the end for questions. I think that both Lonnie and Raymond shared a little bit about who we are already, so I won't talk more about Disability Rights California, and we'll move right on to introduction to special education. I'd like to start with a proposition that we are probably very familiar with, which is that public schools are supposed to be for all students. That's regardless of the language they speak, their race, or where they come from, regardless of whether they have a disability or not. And so if you look at the law, the legal landscape, what we have on the next slide is 3 concentric circles. There's a big green circle that represents all students, students with disabilities and students without disabilities. Then there's a smaller blue circle inside. There's a law called the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which covers some students with disabilities. And then an even smaller circle inside, which stands for the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. That covers an even smaller group of students with disabilities. So to give you a little more detail, Section 504, if we can go to the next slide, this is the law that provides accommodations in a general education environment. So this is for students who have a disability that substantially limits a major life activity. It can be education related. So a major life activity it can be learning, but it can also be walking, breathing, any major life activity that is impaired by a disability means the student is protected by Section 504. And under Section 504, the school needs to provide accommodations to allow them to access general education. Now, like I said, in the even smaller circle, the IDEA provides even more protections. This is the world of special education. For some students, the IDEA not only guarantees accommodations to access general education, it actually says the school needs to design and provide a free, appropriate public education, which is what we call a FAPE, in the least restrictive environment. And that could mean we're no longer in a general education classroom. It could mean we're in a special education classroom. It could mean we are still in a general education classroom, but providing the kinds of supports and services that are needed. And this smaller circle that the IDEA covers is only for students who are eligible. And we'll talk a little bit more about eligibility a little later in the presentation. But this will be for students who have a qualifying disability that falls into one of the 13 categories that are listed in the IDEA. And I want to talk a little bit more about the IDEA for just a moment. So if we could go to the next slide, I'll share 2 quotes from the IDEA. The first is the law says Congress finds that disability is a natural part of the human experience, and it in no way diminishes the right of individuals to participate or contribute to society. So disability is a natural part of the human experience. And then the next quote in the next slide, it also says, all children with disabilities are entitled to a free, appropriate public education that emphasizes special education and related services to meet their unique needs and prepare them for a future. When I think about this, I really want to impress on us, the law is saying the responsibility is on the school to meet your students' unique needs, because disability is a natural part of the human experience. Another way of thinking about this is on the next slide. I wanted to talk just for a minute about something called the social model of disability. And what we'll do is share it's a 1-minute video from a PBS special where the host and somebody he interviews will talk about the difference between the medical model of disability and the social model of disability. The video is 1 minute long. It will be in English, but there will be Chinese and Spanish subtitles at the bottom of the screen.
This is where the social model of disability comes in. Instead of forcing someone to fit into society, what if parts of society could be tweaked to better support the person?
We are perfectly fine the way we are, but that we do need accommodations to be able to thrive in life. We can look at it like this. The medical model, you have a person in a wheelchair where they're trying to get into a building. The medical model says, well, that person has a disability and they need to be fixed in order to get through that door. The social model, on the other hand, recognizes, hey, this person has a wheelchair and they need to get in the building. Let's build a ramp so they can get in. If you apply that to autism, the medical model sees autism as the problem, that it needs to be fixed for society to be better. The social model recognizes that the autistic person is in a world that just isn't designed for them. It's designed for neurotypical people.
So I think that video and the social model of disability gives us a way to think about what the law is also telling schools they need to do, which is that parents don't need to be told, you need to fix your student to fit into the class. You don't need to use the stairs if the stairs don't work for you because you're in a wheelchair. It's actually the school that has the responsibility to build the ramp or to design instruction and classes in a way that meets your child's unique needs if your child is in special education. And what that means is, special education is not a place. It doesn't mean your student is now assigned to a specific special education class. What it actually means it's a pool of services. What's the list of things that the school and parent are going to do together to make sure that a qualifying student can receive a free and appropriate public education? So in just a moment, I'm going to pass this over to Gabriella to talk through a roadmap of the special education process. But we thought before we did that, we might get a sense of who's in this space with us today. We have a quick poll. Lonnie and Raymond are going to launch a poll. You will see 3 questions. It is the exact same question. The first question just happens to be in English. The second will be the same question in Spanish. And the third is the same question in Chinese. So if you would please scroll to whichever language is most comfortable for you and answer a question about your experience with special education. You can choose as many as apply. Maybe this is your first time hearing about special education. Maybe you're familiar, but you want to learn more. Maybe you actually know a lot about special education. You might have a child who already receives special education, or maybe your child doesn't currently receive it, but you think they probably need it. And again, just choose the language that applies to you. So Raymond, my poll went away. I wonder if you can show us results. just so we can get a sense of who's in the room. Okay, looks like we've got lots of people who are saying I'm somewhat familiar with special education, but are here to learn more. A good group of people across the languages that are saying I have a child who receives it. Some folks are saying I have a child who doesn't currently receive it, but I suspect they might need some assistance. I also see at least a handful saying this is my first time. Welcome. We're glad you're here. And others who know quite a bit, also glad that you're here, and hope you all, weigh in toward the end when we have some discussion if you have things to share. So appreciate folks participating in that poll. Gabriella, why don't I hand it over to you?
Great, thank you so much, Leah. Hello, everybody. My name is Gabriela Torres. I'm really excited to be presenting with for you today and with my colleague Leah. So we're gonna go over what something that the team, the youth practice group at Disability Rights created, which is the special education roadmap. Well, on the next slide, you'll see that it is a map that identifies the 6 main steps on the IEP special education journey. First, I'm going to go over it kind of as an overview, and then the following slides will then delve into each specific area with a little bit more detail. So we appreciate that special education and having a child qualify for special education services can be complicated. There's a lot of resources, but there's also a lot of information that isn't provided sometimes until you go through the process. So the first step is in the special education journey is noticing or finding signs that the child, your child or a child, has a disability that is affecting their education. So that's the first step, seeing that there is potentially a need there. So in order to qualify for special education, students have to be assessed by their school district of residence. And I'll just add here that students can qualify for an IEP as early as kindergarten. And they can also qualify at any time during their educational journey. So some students are eligible for an IEP starting school. Some qualify as soon as they start school and are assessed. And others might qualify in grade school, middle school, even high school, because as people, we experience different things in our lives, illnesses, trauma, and some disabilities manifest as we get older. So you can qualify for an IEP at almost any time. So the second part is initial assessments, and we'll talk more about the timelines a little bit later, but very, very roughly, the initial assessments take about 60 days to complete once an assessment plan is signed. But we will talk about the actual assessments in the future slide. After assessments are completed, there is an initial IEP meeting. This IEP meeting requires that the parents are included as part of the IEP team. And the purpose of this meeting is to review assessments and decide if the student that was assessed qualifies for special education services or not. Now, if a student doesn't qualify for an IEP at this meeting, there are several things that could happen. So either the family can request a 504 plan, or the family has the ability to ask for an independent educational evaluation to more or less challenge the results of the initial IEP assessments. The fourth thing is that during the special education journey, the IEP team needs to meet at least one time per year in order to review the IEP. So once a student has an IEP, there's an annual meeting that reviews the goals and the baselines, the supports and services, and the progress of the student. And that happens every year. There's another timeline that applies to the review of the IEP, which is a triennial. A triennial is a reassessment. Students need to be reassessed in all areas of suspected need every 3 years. So there will be a year in which the student has a triennial assessment, usually occurring at the time that the annual IEP would usually occur. And that's the 5th step, the reassessment. And then finally, at the end of this like road, you exit special education. There's several ways you can exit special education. First, it's if the IEP team no longer believes that a student is eligible for an IEP. A parent always has the right to withdraw their student from special education and not consent to the IEP. That's the second way. And the third way is that a student is exited from IEP either when they graduate with a high school diploma or they reach the age of 22. So that's kind of like the little journey. We're going to go just delve a little bit more into each of these steps. Starting up with on the next slide with signs that your child has a disability affecting their education. So the federal law and state law in California require that students are identified by school districts. It's called child find. The school districts must find the students in their district who potentially have a disability and might qualify for special education, and those students must be assessed. So there's several ways that students would be identified. You can be identified by your doctor and referred. Usually this would be the doctor either refers to a regional center and then start services, and the regional center would then work with the parent on contacting the school district and requesting assessments. Parents can also request special education assessments if they notice a change in behavior or a disability, or if they just want their child to be assessed for special education because they believe there might be a disability that's affecting their education. Teachers can refer for special education assessments as well. Now, while teachers and school administrators can refer, the school cannot assess a student for special education without the parent's consent, right? This is just a referral. But if a parent wants a student assessed for special education, they would put that request in writing and send that over to the school district. There are lots of different signs that your child might have a disability that affects your education. Those could include behavior, and it's different types of behavior. It could be anything from inattention to actual things like physical aggression or unwillingness to do work. It could be anxiety or social stress. It could even be something like difficulty with peer relationships. Refusal to do work is sometimes a sign that there's a disability related need that could be based on a learning disability. And these manifest in different ways for students. But the parents always have the right to request the special education assessments in writing. So that request is put in writing. And then if you could go to the next slide. Once a school district receives a request for special education assessments, the school district must present you with a written assessment plan within 15 days of your request. This 15-day period is told for breaks in excess of 5 business days. So 5 of vacation for five days. So if like you give a written request during spring break, those days are told, those don't count. So it's 15 days. And once you consent to the assessment plan itself, consent is your written permission for the assessment to begin. The school would have 60 days to complete all of its assessments and to hold an IEP meeting. The assessment plan itself is really important, and we have a copy of one later on in the slides, but it lists all the areas that the school district is proposing to assess your child in. That can be anything from academic to speech and language, occupational therapy, behavior, social emotional needs. And so the assessment plan really is a document that the family should look at and consent to before signing in. If there's any areas that are missing, that should be communicated to the school. We're going to continue on our journey through the roadmap here. And this is the copy of the assessment plan that I was referring to. I understand that the actual, it's very, very small and difficult to see, but I believe these are going to be provided to you to review as well. But this is an example of an assessment plan. I believe this is this might be your SELPA's. So it might be familiar to those of you who have asked for special education assessments, but essentially you'll be getting something like this. And if you see there is the names of the different evaluations that can be conducted. And so this lists the areas that will be assessed, right? And they include academic, health. I'm having a hard time reading it as well. Intellectual development, language and speech communication, development, motor skills, social emotional, adaptive behavior. There's other sections as well. So the assessment plan will tick the boxes that the assessment will occur in. And then next to that, there is an evaluation, I think it says title, examiner title, and that is the name or the title of the person who will conduct the actual assessment. A lot of these will be either the school psychologist or a speech and language pathologist who will conduct a lot of these assessments, but it should tell you the title of the person conducting the assessment itself. And then if you scroll down, so then the final thing is there is a section here, it says signature of parent, because the assessment cannot be completed until or commenced until the family signs. So you would sign here and you would date it and you would return that to the school. Okay, and we can move on. And so after 60-day period expires, there should be a scheduled IEP meeting. And at this IEP meeting, the IDEA actually lists the people who constitute an IEP meeting, right? That includes the parent. A student can participate, and some students do enjoy participating, others do not. We do encourage students from the age of 14 to start attending their IEP meetings, so that they can have a say in their educational program itself. It's especially important once they get to the age of 16 and you're working on transitional programs within the IEP. But at the initial IEP meeting, all of the assessors who have assessed the student must be present to present their findings and determine whether or not the student is eligible for an IEP. If the student is eligible for the IEP, the team will create an individualized education program that lists the special education eligibility, the supports, services, the educational setting, and goals for the student. Some advice we give to parents who are going to have an initial IEP meeting is to, about 2 weeks before the IEP meeting, to email the school IEP coordinator and ask them for copies of all of the evaluations and assessments that have been completed. You should also ask for a copy in your native language as well, if you require translation. In addition, you should ask for a copy of a draft IEP. Oftentimes, before the IEP meeting, there's already a draft created. So you want to see that before, so that you can go to the meeting prepared. Additional things that I would recommend are, as a parent, you have a right to record the IEP meeting all you have to do is provide 24 hours advance notice. But we'll get more into that later. Those are just some things I wanted to point out in addition. I know we're going to mention them later as well. If your child is found eligible, you will have an IEP, and that will be the date of the annual IEP meeting. Moving on forward, if they're not found eligible for an IEP, you can request a 504 plan, which is covered by a different law. So there's different rules for that, but the rules and procedures around 504 are governed by federal law, but each district creates its own 504 rules and procedures. So you should reach out to your school district and ask for your district's 504 rules and procedures. And then if you believe that your child, if your child is not found eligible for a special education, but you believe that they have an unmet need, you can request an independent education evaluation, which is a second opinion from a provider of your choice. The law says that parents have a right to request an independent education evaluation when they disagree with a school district's assessment. And if you request an IEE, the school district must either fund your independent evaluation, or they must do something called file a request for due process, which is an administrative lawsuit to defend their evaluation. Oftentimes school districts do fund the IEEs, and after the IEE, you'll convene another meeting to see if the student can qualify for an IEP. We can go to the next slide. Oh, yeah, sorry. And there's 13 categories that will qualify a student for an IEP. I am just going to read them off here so that we have them, so that we've all heard them at least once. So you have to have one of these eligibility categories in order to have an IEP. So it's a hearing impairment, deafness, visual impairment and hearing impairment, speech or language impairment, severe orthopedic impairment, autism spectrum disorder, other health impairment, which is really a broad category. It's anything that limits your strength, vitality, or alertness. So things that would call it, so ADHD would qualify under other health impairment. That's one of the most common ones. But there's other medical issues that would qualify you under this as well. Intellectual disability, emotional disturbance, learning disabilities, traumatic brain injury, and multiple disabilities. And so, like we said earlier, when we were looking at the different ways you can qualify for special education or education services, we have this this universe where all students are present. And within like a smaller bubble within that is section 504. So under section 504, you get accommodations in the general education environment. And that can look like a lot of things, you know, extra time on tests, preferred seating, reduced assignments. That's typically what that looks like, but those are provided in general education setting. The IDEA provides for a free and public education in the appropriate public education in the least restricted environment. And for that, you do have to have one of the 13 eligibility categories. But you get services, supports, accommodations within either the general education classroom, a special day class, or other types of environments as well. So it's more specific as well. And okay, and then I think this is my last slide before I turn it back to Leah. So parents have rights at IEP meetings. I've mentioned a few of these already. So you can request an IEP meeting whenever you would like to discuss a change in your child's IEP, or if you just have a new concern or you don't think that something is working, then you can request an IEP meeting by contacting your IEP team coordinator. Sometimes it's the school vice principal or principal. I always recommend to do this in writing. The school must convene that IEP meeting within 30 days of your request. In practice, they tend to happen earlier, but it should not be within more than 30 days. The IEP, the team must meet at a time and place that works for you. So they do need to work with you in order to convene this IEP meeting. that you're afforded the right to be a meaningful participant. So your questions, your concerns need to be taken into account, and decisions cannot be made before the IEP meeting or without your input being considered. You can bring other people to support you to the meeting. That could be anyone, a neighbor, your aunt, another parent, and a hired advocate, a nurse, or anyone. You have a right to bring anybody that you want to the IEP meeting. You do have a right to have language interpretation during the IEP meeting if English is not your first language. You just have to request that from the school. And like I mentioned earlier, you can record the IEP meeting upon giving 24 hours notice. And when you are providing notice, you're just giving notice that I'm going to be recording. You're not asking for permission. It's your right as long as you give 24 hours notice to do so.
Thanks, Gabriella. And I understand there may be a couple questions in the Q&A, and this may be a good time to pause for them. Raymond and recording again. So we'll pick up here, and the next section of our presentation is called What's in an IEP. So as a recap, we walked through the first couple steps of the special education roadmap. There were some signs of a potential disability. An assessment was requested in writing. There was an initial assessment and then initial IEP meeting. At the IEP meeting, let's say the student was found eligible. The student fell in one of those 13 categories of disability, and that disability affected the student's education. What then goes into the IEP? What we have up here on the screen, and Raymond, if we could do the full screen version that you had done last time, I think that will be helpful for folks to be able to see, is, as Gabriella mentioned, we believe this is the IEP form that Palo Alto School District uses. Every IEP is going to contain some pages at the beginning with some demographic information about the student. And if we can click through, there's also a section you'll see that says the type of meeting. So is it the first IEP meeting? Is it an annual, meaning the once a year meeting? Is it a triennial? And Gabriella mentioned, every 3 years, the school district is required by law to conduct new assessments. So it's a longer IEP meeting because they have to review the new assessments, and that's called a triennial IEP. And then there are all sorts of other reasons that a team might meet, maybe to amend the IEP, or because a parent has asked for it, or because it's time to plan for a transition to the next sort of stage of a young person's life. You also have, you'll see on this second page, a box that says the student is eligible or not eligible for an IEP, and then some lines where the school district is going to write down what is the student's disability. There does not have to be a primary disability and a secondary disability, but for some students, there may be more than one category. So we'll click through. There will then be in the IEP a section for present levels of academic achievement and functional performance, what we call PLOPs. And this will be a set of pages where, as an IEP team, you're taking note of the student's current performance in a bunch of different categories. And that's going to be based on assessments. It's also going to be based on parent and teacher observations or things that they are noticing. And that's to give sort of a sense of where the student is currently performing. And then there's a section of the IEP, which a parent had brought up previously, where you're setting goals for the coming year. Now, this is what the Palo Alto IEP form goals page looks like. And you'll see, if we can click through, there's usually a place to put the area of need. So if the IEP team has identified reading, writing, maybe behavior, academic readiness skills, social emotional needs as an area of special education need for the student, they're going to put that up there. And then there will be a section for the student's baseline. So where is the student currently in this area of need? And then finally, an annual goal. So the team is going to put their heads together and come up with a goal for the student to work toward for the coming year in their IEP. Now, the thing about IEP goals is that they have to be in all of the students' areas of need. So if the IEP team has assessments that show that the student has needs in reading, writing, and math, they have to create goals in all three of those areas. They can't just create a reading goal and call their job done. It also has to contain a baseline. You have to give a sense in the IEP of where the student is currently performing in that area of need. And a goal has to be measurable. So I'll put up here on the slide an example of a goal. And my question to you all will be, what's wrong with this goal? And we'll just take a few hands maybe and ask, maybe folks can just unmute themselves since I know the chat has been disabled, potentially sharing. So this goal is in the area of writing for this student. And the baseline says, Gabriella can write a little. She can write letters when orally provided the sound. And then the goal is by next year, when orally provided with 10 words, Gabriella will spell and write words with 90% accuracy. What's wrong with this goal? Maybe Gabriella and I can just have a conversation. What's wrong with this goal?
Yeah, so I think this goal, well, I think if you look at it, you initially think, oh yeah, there's a baseline and there's a goal. But if you're looking at the baseline, what does it mean that Gabriella can write a little? Does that mean Gabriella can write 3-letter words, 2-letter words? She can write a sentence of 3 words or just words? And what sounds can she write when orally presented? If you look at the actual baseline, it's really difficult to know what it's really me, what I can do. And then with the actual goal, it's still like I don't see the relationship between the baseline and the actual goal. Like, how do we know that I've met that goal?
Yeah, when it says, when orally provided 10 words, Gabriella will spell and write those words with 90% accuracy. But, is that any kind of words, kindergarten level words? What kind of words? So we can see how, and I think this is the point that the parent was bringing up. It's vague, it's a gray area. It's not, maybe another word for it is, it's not necessarily measurable. It's not clear how we'll know whether at the end of the year, Gabriella has accomplished this goal. So maybe we'll go to the next slide. You'll see we put a little X next to that goal that we think is probably deficient. And we've offered what's potentially a better goal, if we could click through. So here's a way we might revise that goal. So again, the same area of writing. This time the baseline says, Gabriella can write her first and last name, and she can write out 24 out of the 36 letters correctly when orally provided with the letter sound. So already we have a much better sense of more specifically where this student is performing in terms of writing. And then the measurable annual goal is by January 30th, 2024, when orally provided with 10 real or nonsense vowel consonant or consonant vowel consonant words that she has not studied prior, Gabriella will spell and write words with 90% accuracy as measured by staff maintained data. So in this case, a lot more specific about what kinds of words. So these are going to be consonant vowel consonant or vowel consonant words that she hasn't been provided before. And they can be real or nonsense according to this goal. So it sounds like we're working not necessarily on a specific vocabulary list, but helping Gabriella learn the phonics of how, words are put together. So a little better, more measurable. The baseline is also more concrete. And so we're hoping this gives parents just a little better of a sense of the kinds of things they're looking out for when it comes to goal setting. You want to imagine to yourself, if you didn't know your student and you weren't a part of this IEP meeting and you picked up this goal and looked at it, would it make sense to you what the student is working towards? And would you be able to tell that the student has actually met the goal at the end of the time allotted? Okay, great. I think I'm turning it back over to Gabriella for a conversation about specially designed instruction.
Yeah, so specially designed instruction, I mean, we do have the actual definition of what specially designed instruction is. But the really unique thing about IEPs is that they are individualized educational programs, which means they are individualized to each unique student. So no IEPs are the same. And the IEP really is individualized because the everything contained within the IEP is based on specially designed instruction. And in practical terms, what that means is that the instruction is tailored to a particular student. And that feeds into the IEP goals. It accounts for the disability. It provides modifications or adaptations to content. And it really does encourage access to the general education curriculum. So let's go to the next slide, where these are some examples of how specially designed instruction is implemented into IEPs. And it means adapting the content, methodology, and the delivery of instruction. These are just some examples. They are not at all exhaustive. There are lots of ways that these can be altered in order to meet the needs of a student. So with respect to instructions, you can customize instruction to meet the needs of a student, either by offering specialized academic instruction in a special day class. So that is a small classroom where a resource teacher or special education teacher really uses specialized academic instruction unique to that student in a smaller class that isn't the general education classroom. You can also address those same, provide that same instruction in a general education classroom if it is appropriate for that student. With respect to accommodations, you can offer extra time during exams, or you can potentially offer the use of a calculator. I mean, these are just examples of how you can specially design, you offer specially designed instruction to students, but there are so many different things that you could offer. A note taker is also something that I've seen. And then modifications. So the actual program itself can be modified. One of the important things is that it still requires the mastery of the concept. So you still have to learn the material, but the actual program itself can be modified to what you're expected to learn. So that could be lowering the reading level that a student can be expected to read at, or simplifying the exam questions themselves is another way. If we go to the next slide. Okay, and so you can also specially design the services. Some examples of ways to do this are offering one-on-one support in class. You see this more with grade school students. By middle school, I think there's a pushback from students to have a one-on-one aid, or a lot of push and support in class, but that could also be specially designed further. You know, is the one-on-one aid assistance, is it in class, or is it during unstructured times like recess and lunch, when students might struggle with behavioral or social issues? In addition, you could offer different levels of behavioral support. It could be supervision by a board certified behavior analyst. It could be check-ins with a behaviorist. It could be support for the family, or for the teachers, with a board certified behavior analyst to really identify and work on the behaviors that a specific student is having, and how it's affecting and impacting the education. And that is a support, the next category here, which is support to personnel and parents. And this could include coaching and training for parents, but also training for teachers and service providers. One of the supports that we often at VRC encourage for students who are experiencing behavioral challenges is to include board certified behavior support for the actual teachers, because what you find is that especially in the high school years, because you'll have a broad range of teachers who, they'll teach English and language and science and PE. And while they're great educators, they don't have that behavioral component to their own education and background. So working with a behavior analyst to really understand, why that student didn't want to dress out for PE. How could I have gotten them to dress out for PE without making the behavior worse? It's making sure that that teacher understands that that student isn't trying to be a bad student or misbehave. It is potentially their disability that is impeding their ability to do what they're being asked of for a lot of different reasons. So support for teachers is also really, really important. And also because, especially as you get older, not all teachers go to all of the IEP meetings, because they're not all required to. It's one general education teacher and one special education teacher that must be present. We can go to the next slide. Okay, yeah, so this is just a list of supplementary services and supports. Some of these we've already gone over, but I think they're also worth mentioning in addition. So a one-on-one or small group academic support, that is a service that can be provided to a student that's different from a special day class. It is really more tailored to the student. Students can receive transportation as part of their IEP. If the transportation, if they require transportation to access their education. There are rules around how an IEP can provide this. Usually you cannot get transportation to a school that you are choiced into. It usually needs to be your home school, but there's other ways to also get around that, but it usually has to be your home school. Students can receive speech and language services. This can be push in or push out, which means this provider can go into the classroom and provide the services, or can pull you out and provide either one-on-one instruction or small group instruction with other peers. Students can receive counseling, physical and occupational therapy to work on their fine and gross motor skills, which is an area of needs for many students. School health services can be provided for students, especially those with medically complex needs at school. A lot of times this involves nursing services. Social work services can be provided as well. Positive behavior interventions is what I was talking about with behaviors. Students with behaviors should have a behavior intervention plan as part of their IEP. And again, parents also can benefit from being provided counseling and training in order to support their students in school. And then we can go to the next one. or my screen's a little bit small. Sorry, I'm having some issues. So all of these services that a student is going to be provided will be contained within the offer of FAPE, which is the offer of free and appropriate public education, which is contained in the actual IEP itself. While again, I think your screen might not be as clear, you will be provided the actual copies of the presentation. But the amount of specialized academic instruction and related services will be on the first page on the left-hand side. It will say whether you're getting specialized academic instruction in small group, in one-on-one, in the large group, in a special day class, how many minutes of that you'll have a week. And it'll include all of the other related services as well, including counseling, adapted occupational therapy, speech and language. Any service will be provided there. In addition, on the page on the right-hand side, there will be the supplemental supports and services that will be offered to the student. And it's really important to review this. This will be discussed with the IEP team, but essentially when you agree to services, this is what you're consenting to be provided. You don't actually have to consent to the entire IEP. You can consent to parts of it. You can decline it as well. But those are just some of the important parts of the IEP itself. If we go to the next page, and again, we believe this is the IEP that most of you have seen, but we're not 100% sure. And then on the next page, you'll have, it'll list all of the accommodations that are being provided to the students. Those could include things like reduced work, seating at the front, movement breaks, ability to leave the classroom when frustrated, fidget spinners, flexible seating, those will be included there, as well as any modifications to the program, which would be anything like a reduced reading level, for example. On the page on the right-hand side, this is the last page, I believe, of the offer of FAPE, it will say the percentage of time that a student is outside of the general education classroom versus in the general education classroom. The IDEA is written on the belief that all students should be in the least restrictive environment, right? And it's really, really important. So we start in general education, and students should only be moved to a more restrictive setting if they require that in order to access their education. But the IDEA and California education, I really encourage general education and students being in the least restrictive environment. Okay,
I can pick up from here, Gabriella.
Great,
if
thank you.
that's helpful. Yeah. So as Gabriella just mentioned, we have a slide here about least restrictive environment just because it is so important. The way that it's defined in the law is that every student, every special education student has a right to learn in their neighborhood school and interact with children who do not have disabilities to the maximum extent appropriate. And so what that means is, yes, we might put this student in a special day class just with other students with disabilities. But if we could keep that student mostly actually in general education, but provide push-in services or provide accommodations or provide tutoring or whatever it is to really support that student in a general education setting, the law says that's what we should be doing. And the reason for that is because there is all kinds of social science research, and I'm sure you as parents know that there is a benefit not just to your student who may have an IEP, but to all students to be in a classroom that is inclusive, that has children with all sorts of needs and with disabilities and without disabilities. That's actually beneficial for everybody, not just the student with the IEP. It's also beneficial for the other students who may or may not have IEPs. So there's, again, always this presumption of the least restrictive environment. And that does mean that schools, though, have to provide the adequate supports and services to ensure that a student can be successful in that least restrictive environment. So we can go to the next.
Before we move on, I'll just note that the least restrictive environment is unique to that student. So we all have a different least restrictive environment. It's not the same for everybody.
That's a great point. Yeah. And I should say it says neighborhood school because we tend to consider non-public schools or schools that are schools that serve students with disabilities in particular to be more restrictive placements, and neighborhood schools to be less restrictive placements. But that's not to say if those placements are what is best and what is least restrictive for your student, that those placements are bad. That's not, you know, what this means. It just means wherever your student is placed, we should always be thinking about how can we make sure that it is the least restrictive environment that is most appropriate to that student. So we can push to the next slide. Gabriella's mentioned this a bunch of times, but let's go full screen. Thank you so much, Raymond. At the end of the IEP meeting, there will be a place for signatures of everybody that was in attendance. If we can click through. And then there will also be a place for parents to give their consent. And I want to stress there are options for parent consent. So it's not, yes, I agree to the IEP, or no, I do not agree to the IEP. Gabriella has mentioned this a few times, but there is an option here. If we could click through, that says, I understand and consent to the contents of the IEP, except for, which means you as a parent can say, I give consent to start getting these services that are in here or to get, you know, this IEP going. But I actually don't agree with, and you can write it out. You know, I actually think that there's another category of disability that my student should be eligible under, or I disagree that, you know, you're not providing such and such services that the student really needs. So there's always a place for you to have your voice heard. And, you know, just want to make sure that parents are aware of that. If we can go to the next slide in full screen mode, there's always then also a page for meeting notes. And you should have an opportunity to carefully review these notes, make sure that they reflect what was discussed. If you raised specific points that were either glossed over, ignored, or not considered by the school district, you can go back and say, these notes don't mention that I specifically asked for ADHD accommodations, and the IEP team said no. I would like the notes to reflect that. You can go back and say that to make sure that the meeting notes really capture what happened in the IEP meeting. Now, the meeting notes should be accurate. You should be able to review them and weigh in. Nothing beats an actual recording of the IEP meeting. We've mentioned this a few times. I think it is worth mentioning again. You have a right to record the IEP meeting. All you have to do is give 24 hours notice. It's not it's not even a request, right? You just have to give notice that I'm going to be recording, you know, this IEP meeting. You can come right into the meeting and, you know, use your phone recorder or whatever it is. If it's a Zoom meeting, you can record the Zoom meeting. And it can be super helpful to have those recordings, because then you really know what exactly was discussed. And if you have a conflict later on, or there's a disagreement over, you know, how things went down, you've got a record, and the law provides you a way to have that record. So worth repeating again, it's been extremely helpful in some of the cases that we've taken up, and parents should know that that's available to them. Okay, so we'll press forward to the next slide. We're back here now at the roadmap. All of that was about IEP meetings. And if we could zoom in to basically this roundabout, this traffic circle, this rotary between steps 4 and 5. So step 4 is going to be review the IEP. And that has to happen, like Gabriella said, at a minimum once a year. But the IEP team has to also meet whenever a parent requests Remember, Gabriella said at a minimum within 30 days of your request, because you have said there's something I want to discuss. Anytime the school wants to propose a change to the IEP, so if they're going to reduce the number of minutes of counseling or push-in services that your student is getting, if they're going to decide, actually, we think he should or she should be in a different type of classroom, that's a placement change, any change to the IEP, they have to have a meeting first, and you have to consent. When your child turns 16 years old and it's time to create a transition IEP, a plan for what's going to happen post high school, there needs to be an IEP meeting. And then finally, if your child is suspended 10 plus days, meaning it within the same school year, so it doesn't have to be 10 days in a row, but 10 plus days within a school year, or the school is going to recommend that student for an expulsion. If the student has an IEP, the school has to first hold an IEP meeting to determine whether the behavior that they're punishing the student for was actually a manifestation of that student's disability. And that's called a manifestation determination review. And we could probably talk for 2 hours just about that. But just so parents know, that's another time when the school district needs to hold an IEP meeting. Step 5 is reassessment. So Gabriella has mentioned this a few times, but the school district is required by law every 3 years to reassess your student. They're going to give you an assessment plan all over again. You're going to look to see all the areas that they want to assess and give your consent all over again, right? Or not give your consent. You can also request a reassessment up to once a school year if you feel your students' needs are changing. But this little traffic circle, this roundabout, this happens in a cycle every year until your student is ready to exit special education. You're going to have annual IEP meetings or maybe even more frequently. And you're going to have triennial assessments or maybe even more frequently. But the school team and which includes the parents, the IEP team needs to continuously meet to make sure that the individualized education program, that the IEP is meeting your child's needs and providing a FAPE. So that then brings us just to the last step in our roadmap here, which is, when does a student exit special education? And I think Gabriella had, mentioned some of this already, but there are only 3 ways that a student is exited from special education. One is there's an IEP meeting and the team decides no longer needed. These services are no longer needed for whatever reason. This child's disability is no longer affecting their education, and we can, close up this IEP. Second, a parent can withdraw their consent at any time and say, I no longer want these services for my child. And then third, when a child graduates from the K-12 school system or ages out of it at 22 years old. That's when they exit special education. So that brings us to the end of this roadmap, and which again, you'll be provided in your materials. And I know Lonnie linked to the PDF of these PowerPoints in the slides. But I know we have maybe at least one question that's come through or a few in the chat. So